All right, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Landscape Success series of lectures presented by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and Fort Bend County Master Gardeners. My name is Brandy Rader and I'm the volunteer coordinator for the Fort Bend County Master Gardeners. If you are new to us, the Fort Bend County Master Gardeners are trained volunteers who assist the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension educating the community with research-based horticulture information. Today, we are presenting Landscape Success class number 5, which will cover weed and nutrient management. This lecture will be recorded and we will email the link and resources to all registrants in the upcoming week. You can find video links of past classes and our Grow Your Own classes on our website, fbmg.org, and a link to the website is already provided in the chat. We kindly ask that you stay muted and turn off your video during the lecture. If you have questions or comments, please put those in the chat and we will address them. I'm thrilled to introduce our instructor and horticulturist, Boone Holliday. Boone holds an undergraduate degree in horticulture from Stephen F. Austin State University and master's degree in agricultural education from Texas A&M University. Whoop! Long before attaining these degree titles, he was an avid gardener and young plant enthusiast. He brings previous experience as horticulture staff at Moody Gardens in Galveston, Producers Cooperative in Bryan, and Texas A&M Horticulture in College Station. Having work experience in many horticultural areas and industry, from retail horticulture to landscape design and irrigation installation. He brings that knowledge paired with enthusiasm into Fort Bend County programming efforts. He is happily married to wife Sony, is the proud father to daughter Bailey, and lives in Fulshire, Texas. Without further ado, I would like to turn the class over to Boone.
Thank you, Brandy. And thank you. Also have Carol with our Fort Bend Master Gardeners. She's the current president of Fort Bend County Master Gardeners Incorporated. And
Howdy.
Carol will be behind the scenes today, wrangling the questions in the chat, making sure that everybody is getting all their questions answered appropriately. So we're going to talk about a pretty timely topic today. This is nutrients and weeds. I'm not sure who decided to lump both of these together into one presentation, but combining these two topics as we get into the summer months, this could be a 6-hour presentation, but I'm going to try my best to kind of chisel this down to something that's manageable for you to absorb and something that's done in a meaningful way that you can take the information to maybe help guide some of your decisions moving forward with applying fertilizers and responding to weeds that you may have in your home landscapes. I'm going to start off with a PowerPoint overview of both of these topics. And then after we get through that, I'm going to guide you over to some of our web resources that'll help you make some self-learning opportunities, as well as some resources that help guide you with some of your response practices. As Brandy mentioned, what we'd like to do for this presentation, for the sake of time to get through in an hour and a half, is just to drop your questions that you have into the chat, and Carol will do her best to respond to those. If the question is appropriate, Carol, if you'll just chime in with that question, if it looks like something that will fit in and add value to the presentation, go ahead and chime in, stop me at that moment, and we'll discuss it. But I imagine several of the presentations might be better off for us to either hold those off towards the end of the presentation or we might be guiding you to our Master Gardener help desk here, where we have volunteers set up throughout the week to help answer your questions. You can email, you can use our web platform, you can call in, or you can stop by our office here in Rosenberg to have those specific questions answered. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. Maybe. And from there. Okay. How we look?
Look great.
Okay. Thank you, Brandy. All right. So here we go. This is part of a series that we have developed called Landscape Success. We're about halfway through with the series. We've got a program coming up August 18th on trees for small landscapes. September 15th is called Fall is for Planting. This is how to successfully plant new trees and shrubs in the landscape. And then on November 17th, as we get into the cool season, hard to imagine we would see a cool season again, but that class is on winter protection to guide our securing the well-being and health of our plants going into possible winter storms. So again, my name is Boone Holiday. I'm one of your county extension agents here in Fort Bend County, and I specialize in areas of horticulture. A big chunk of this presentation was adapted by a presentation developed by one of our own master gardeners, Miss Mary Parkhouse, on weeds, weed management in the landscape. So all the information that you see when I discuss weeds was prepared by her. So thank you, Mary, for that. Much appreciated. So we're going to start off right off the bat here talking about nutrient management and just kind of go over some main things that kind of help maybe outline fertilization and inputs nutrient wise into our home landscapes. The first part we're going to talk about is fertilizers. And see real quick, Carol or Brandy, you mentioned, I think we got somebody maybe on there with a little bit of audio interaction.
I think I got them.
Double check that. All right, so most of the fertilizers, you know, if we go to our local garden supply, it's going to look like this label, turf food. We have these 3 numbers here, which basically represent a percentage of our top 3 macronutrients. Macronutrients meaning that these are the nutrients that we use or plants use in the greatest abundance. So if we're talking about what we would call a complete fertilizer, if you hear that terminology used, a complete fertilizer, it means that it has some percentage of all 3 of these elements. Nitrogen, it being the first one, phosphorus being the second, and potash or potassium being the 3rd number. They'll always be represented in that order as those 3, and that's by United States Department of Agriculture. What defines a complete fertilizer is having some percentage of each of those 3. Does that mean that it has to have those? No, but then we would call that an incomplete fertilizer, where we're trying to maybe focus on one nutrient addition more than others. As we can see in this one here, at a rate of 12, 4, 8, we are applying a little bit more nitrogen for this soil, and then the appropriate balance or ratio of phosphorus and potassium with that. Also, in those here, it says 50% organic. And as we can see here in this breakdown of nitrogen, we have a percentage of this nitrogen that it's water insoluble nitrogen, which means that it's not quick release. It is a slow release nitrogen versus one that's going to be quickly released into the soil and potentially absorbed by the plant. So this is just kind of a snapshot, typically what you would see when you go to your hardware store or your garden center looking for fertilizers. Is you'll see at least these three represented on the back of the bag. But going further into detail on nutrients is, we've got a bigger snapshot of what we would like to see in the soil. The first one being our soil pH. And the soil pH is a measurement of the power of the hydrogen molecules within the soil, basically meaning if our soil is acidic or basic, where it's rated on a scale of 0 to 14, where neutral is at 7.0. And we'll find that most of our plants, as noted here, prefer a range of pH between 6.0 and 7, where really 6.5 is kind of the magic number for most plants. But then we look at all the nutrients that plants need. This is not all of them. This is about half of the nutrients that plants use for some stage of growth and development. But these are the ones that they use the most of, that are critical for healthy plant development. The first one we see here are primary nutrients. As I mentioned, when we look at a bag of fertilizer, typically we're going to see these top three numbers on those bags, represented in a percentage of that active ingredient in the total weight of the product. First one being nitrogen, then phosphorus, and then potassium. So what this shows is a breakdown here of what we would like to see in the soil as a percentage. So we would like to see nitrogen in a range of 2% minimum, and then so forth as we go down this list. We're starting off this nitrogen at 2 to 4%. And as we get down to the secondary nutrients, and specifically with some of our micronutrients, the nutrients that we use in much smaller amounts, we're not talking about percentages anymore. We're talking about availability in parts per million. So not nearly as much of these, but they are necessary at some stage of plant development. And if they are not available, then we'll start to see some nutrient deficiency issues within the plants, usually a yellowing of color, a stunting of growth, and then that might lead into insect and disease damage, because the overall health of the plant is diminished by the deficiencies of those nutrients. And then down here, salts or total dissolved salts within the soil. Typically, we want a lower number on those. Higher the salt value, we can start getting some plant necrosis either within the roots or the foliage of the plant. So we want these, but we want to try to keep the salt levels down. Okay, so what is pH? I mentioned that in the last slide. A little that might have gotten over your head, but basically what pH stands for is the potential of the hydrogen ion within a soil profile. But a simpler way to put that is that it's a measure of either the acidity, as you see in green, whether it's acid, or the alkalinity or a base of the solution on a scale of 0 to 14, where 7 is neutral. So we take something like milk, which may have a a high pH, or something like coffee that has a low pH. You can measure this on basically any item, but within soil and considering plants, we like a balanced pH. We like a pH that is about 6.5 for most plants. If you've been gardening for most of your life, you probably hear when we talk about plants in the blueberry family. And this is blueberries, all of our azaleas, rhododendrons are plants that prefer an acid soil. So that number may go down to 5 or 5.5, which is fairly acid. Or we might have plants like a hydrangea, for instance, which its name hydrangea was based off of this potential of the hydrogen ion, hydrangea, where if we can alter the pH of the soil, either acid or base, we can actually change the color of the flower, go from pink to blue, depending on the pH within the soil. But for the most part, and there's some exceptions to this for sure, but for the most part, we like to stay in that range of 6 to 7, where 6.5 is kind of the magic spot. Yes, Carol.
And we have one good question. What can be done if there is too much salt in the soil? Do those magnet devices really help?
There are a lot of products with claims out there that maybe through the work that we do in academia, we probably don't have results on. The only true recommendation that we can offer for salt accumulation is through leaching, and this is by us finding ways to move water through that soil profile to try and move those salts out, either down into the soil profile beneath the root zone of the plant, or off the surface through surface leaching to try to get those out. Problem there is, if we have a salt problem, it's usually the water that we're applying to the soil to care for these plants. It may be a water that's been tested that shows elevated total dissolved salts. So while we're trying to correct a salt imbalance, and the recommendation being that we add more water to leach that with highly elevated salts in the water, a person could say, well, that doesn't make much sense. But in the process of purposeful leaching, of removing those higher concentrations, we may be doing it with a water that has a high salt value, but we are still dropping the concentration of salts in that process. And really that, or just depending on good drainage and natural rainfall events, are the only proven techniques that we currently have to recommend. Good question. So why is pH important? This is a pretty complicated little graph here. But basically, if I kind of move down this graph, all these little targets, I see down here is a scale of pH at the bottom. If you'll look with me, the left side says pH of 4.0, and then the right side goes up to 10.0. And then we have this most plants ideal pH right here at 6.5. And so what this means, this line here, all the way up and down, it shows the availability of these nutrients that are in the soil when we are in a certain pH range. So we'll start with the top of nitrogen. So right here in this sweet spot, nitrogen is most available to plants, readily available for uptake in the soil. As we move to either acid or a basic condition, the nitrogen that's in the soil is bound up with this potential of the hydrogen ion, right? It's a scientific way for saying this becomes bound up in the soil and it's not available for the plant to use. So as we go higher or lower, we may have nitrogen there, but it's bound up like a magnet in the soil and it's not available for the plants to take uptake. So every nutrient works a little differently. So you see some of them here, you get a pretty good uptake on phosphorus at a very high pH. But as you go down to more of an acid profile, you start to, this diminishes pretty quickly. But the common within all of these is right here in that sweet spot is kind of the common denominator of maximum availability in the soil. And this is why for most plants, they perform the best at this 6.5 to 7 range, because that's when the nutrients are available for it to utilize in the soil.
Boone, I have another good question.
Mhm.
Considering the hot temperatures, are there certain nutrients that are good for lawns and plants when it is hot?
I'm not going to give that answer back probably in the way that they are hoping for, but as you know, if I go back and I showed that slide where here of this 2 to 4% nitrogen, 0.5% phosphorus, and so forth. This is kind of a coefficient that's based off of ensuring maximum plant health and plant development. So if we're within these ranges with all these different nutrients or minerals in the soil, then hypothetically the plant is going to be more durable. And I don't think it's necessarily one or the other. You know, what we've heard in the past is some of these sayings where with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, we say up, down, and all around, or you know, there's a whole bunch of different ones out there which suggest that nitrogen is for up, for green growth, phosphorus is for root growth, down, and then the potassium is all around, which just would suggest all around plant health. While those are true, probably the bigger thing is that we have all these nutrients balanced within the soil so that the plants are getting just what they need of each one of those. And so if the plant is securing each of those in the appropriate amount, then it will be healthy. And then if a plant is healthy, it's going to be able to succumb any type of environmental stress, whether it's cold, hot, dry, floods, or pest and disease pressure as well. Really good questions. Thank you, Carol. All right, so we're gonna move up to the next slide here. Okay, good, doing good. Okay, so what this little diagram shows is the difference between a quick release or a slow release type fertilizer and kind of the impacts on the plant. This being turf grass as an example, shows the first one there shows the time of application and then the weeks along the bottom, and you see this very high rise in the growth rate of that grass, and then within a 2-week period it tops out, and then we have this very quick fall on the back end where the nutrients, particularly in this case probably nitrogen, is used up, and then we have it go down really quick as far as the growth. So you just get this fast spurt of growth, versus in a slow release fertilizer, whether it's encapsulated in some formation where it's slowly available to plants, or if we're talking about maybe some organic additives within there that have to be gradually broken down by microbial activity in the soil and then released at this slower calendar. What that does is that it lessens this wave out where we have a longer period of growth within that plant. Now, there's a lot of takeaways from this, but probably the main one is that we're kind of jolting the grass with a quick release. So we want to see this green up, so you put this quick release fertilizer out. We want to see it green up, but then the consequence of that is that as that goes away, that plant may be weak and may become more susceptible to environmental impacts moving forward. So basically suggests that if we can, we're going to look at inputting more slow release nutrient additives into our management plan to kind of stretch out this fertilization to secure long-term health of the plant. So I mentioned organic fertilizer additives. We see a list of some common additives here that can bring a nitrogen level. That's really the biggest user, nitrogen mineral being the highest used and the quickest one that goes away. The difference between nitrogen and some of the other minerals for plant growth is that not only is it used up very readily by plants, but it's also water soluble. So it will leach out of the profile very quickly during a heavy storm event. And it's also volatile. So as it heats up, it will evaporate into nitrogen gas into the atmosphere. So we need to find ways to add nitrogen. And we see with organic fertilizers, we tend to have to use quite a bit of product because the actual content of nitrogen tends to be quite low. But there's a pretty good selection of products where we can get that slow release nitrogen added into our fertilization schedule. Versus if you see down here at the bottom with the synthetic forms, these will be our typical synthetic forms of nitrogen and chemical fertilizers. The most common being 2100, which is ammonium sulfate, 18460 diammonium phosphate, and then urea at 46% nitrogen. So you get higher levels of nitrogen within these synthetic forms, which suggests that we may talk about a blend of synthetic fertilizers or nutrient additives, but really looking at organic options to slow down the release of those nutrients within the soil. All right. So organic matter in the soil profile is very important, and I'll go through a list here in a second of all the benefits of organic matter. But basically, what we're seeing here side by side are two soil cutouts. The one in front with a high profile and depth of organic matter, a humus layer in the soil that shows up as this dark coloration, versus a soil here behind it with a very low content of organic matter. There's not really much of a humus layer there at all, which suggests that we have to pamper this grass to get it to continue growing. Where in this profile here, a couple things are going to happen. We're going to have deeper root penetration down into the subsoil. We're going to have better moisture retention in this profile. and it's going to be able to bank nutrients longer in the soil so that plants can continually pull from the nutrients that are absorbed in that organic profile layer. Um, but what we know is, in a home lawn situation, to maintain a soil that looks like this, it has to be purposeful, because we're not adding organic sources on top of that profile. If we think about a native prairie, on a prairie type setting, we have plants that are growing and dying, growing and dying. We have animals that are moving across that, excreting waste, dying, and then all that organic matter being absorbed into this profile. But when we get into a home landscape situation where we're just mowing this grass and continuing to pull from it, especially if we're bagging the leaf clippings off of it, the layer of organic matter that's present in that spot is going to continually diminish until where the level is almost at 0%. So I mentioned humus. Basically, this picture here is that it has a high level of decomposed organic matter that's been processed by earthworms, beetle larvae, in a full range of micro biota, which would be fungal, bacterial, protozoans that are digesting the organic matter within that, and then turning it into something that the plants can use. We start off with is the raw organic matter, and in our case, for home landscapes, we're going to call that compost. So best way for us to replenish the soil with organic matter is by purchasing and applying a top dressing of good finished compost on some type of a schedule. Once or twice a year would be a good rate of application of compost. These benefits here of adding organic matter in the form of compost through either in our flower beds, around trees, the root system of trees, in our turf grass areas, all do the same thing. It helps loosen the soil, helps aggregate or build soil structure. It's a nutrient source for plants. And as I also mentioned, it acts as a nutrient bank. It holds those nutrients kind of like a sponge within that organic profile, allowing a slow release of those nutrients for the use by plants. The sponge also actually is the same concept with water. It holds water in the soil profile longer. It increases aeration, so we have better oxygen down into the root zone of plants. If we know about the process of respiration, plants, all parts of the plants need to breathe by a process called respiration, roots included. So we need this aeration to allow the oxygen down into the soil so that the roots can breathe. It provides food for microorganisms. It helps to buffer our soil pH, keeping us within the range that we want to be at. It regulates soil temperature and helps to prevent soil erosion. So a lot of good reasons to add organic matter in the form of compost into our home landscapes. At some point, we'll talk about maybe a disclaimer to this as we move forward. So pay attention for that. So how do we know what's going on? How do we know what the percentage of our organic matter is? How do we know what our current levels of nutrients in the soil are? And this is a process that we call soil analysis or soil sampling. And it's very easy to do. There are some measuring devices that you can get at your garden centers that you prod down into the soil, and it just basically gives you a range that says you've got good nutrients or you need more. There are some buffer kits that you can purchase that have some acid buffer strips that you can, break down the soil and try to do a rudimentary chemistry type analysis of some of the nutrients and the pH of the soil. That's a little technical and probably more than most people would want to do on their own. So what we recommend is using either a service that we offer through AgriLife Extension, or there are several other soil sampling labs across the state. We prefer that you utilize our lab at the university because we're quite familiar in Extension with interpreting the results from those samples. So basically, as you can see here, you go out into your lawn. This gentleman here has a soil probe where he's probing down and pulling out a core sample. You're going to take 7 to 10 core samples from a designated area across, and this looks like a front lawn, and mix those together, aggregate those together into one representative sample. And you put them in the bag here. We'll even provide the soil sample bag free of charge. You can just use a Ziploc bag if you just wanted to do it all from home. That works perfectly fine as well. But basically, you're packaging up your soil. You're adding an application form with that I'll show you where you can find that at on their website. But basically, it's just asking questions like, what are we trying to sample? Give us some information on the site and how you've treated it. And that's going to help the soil lab interpret the results that they get and give you a recommendation on how to respond to that sample. So it's like we're figuring out what's in the soil, but then we're also giving you a recommendation on what type of minerals you need to apply to balance out the nutrients within that soil profile. So I'll start with this. This was that's a typical soil analysis. This is kind of what you would see if you send a soil sample in. This one here says we got Travis County, which is Austin, and they're sampling a garden vegetable bed as their sample. So if we look at this, if you can follow my mouse, I'm going to start here with this pH. Okay, and so we go over here, the results says 7.7. As I mentioned, our magic critical level where we want to be at is at 6.5. That's our magic number. So we're higher than that. So this is basically saying that we are moderately alkaline. Okay, moderate means it's not really out of hand, but really for me, if it's above 7.5, it is a little out of hand because we're going to start seeing some poor plant growth because of poor nutrient uptake in the soil. So this is one thing that we may want to address. And then we're going to start going down to our nutrients, starting off with our macronutrients of our nitrate. If I go across here on nitrate, our level here is 2, which is almost at 0. And then this graph here is a way to help you kind of visualize any type of deficiency or overage of that particular mineral. The dotted line here being our critical level. This is kind of where we want to target our graph at, or our amount. And we're way down here at the end on none, which suggests that we need some nitrogen in the soil. There's hardly anything there. So we need to bring this graph probably way up here, just a little bit past this critical level, to get that up to where the plants are getting the nitrogen that they're needing for plant growth, for new tissue development. And so along with that is this fertilizer recommendation. And it's telling us here we need 1.3 pounds of nitrogen, of actual nitrogen, per 1,000 square foot of space. So if this garden is a 1,000 square foot, we need 1.3 pounds of nitrogen. So you can decide how we're applying that. Like I mentioned, with those lower values of nitrogen with organic additives, or if we went with a conventional fertilizer, we would have to use less of that product. So for instance, the ammonium sulfate that I mentioned earlier, that's 21% nitrogen. Basically, we just multiply this by 5, assuming 21%, that's basically 1/5. So we're going to multiply it by 5. So about 6 to 7 pounds of ammonium sulfate fertilizer per 1,000 square feet. Okay. But if we're doing an organic fertilizer that has much less percentage of nitrogen, that number may look more like 20 pounds or 25 pounds of fertilizer per 1,000 square feet to get the number that you want. So those are the first two things that are critical. pH is high, nitrogen is low, but then we have this next one here, our phosphorus. Okay, and the phosphorus, so the results are 246. Our magic number is 50, which shows that we're way over. We're way over. We got way too much phosphorus in the soil. And that's gonna mess us up, because just important of having enough of something, we don't want to have any of these minerals in an excessive overage as we do in this phosphorus. Because what that can do, if you have any background in chemistry, is we have these molecular bonds happening, and that phosphorus starts bonding with other minerals that you have in the soil, making them unavailable for plants. It's basically like a big magnet in the soil, and that phosphorus is binding up all these negatively charged molecules and not allowing them to be released into the water strata where the roots can grab them up and absorb them. So we don't want these big numbers in here. And sometimes if we get a soil sample back that is really elevated in phosphorus, the lab will add a note down here that says, do not add any more phosphorus fertilizers, please, noting that number needs to come down. And the only way that number comes down is that if it is used by plants. This phosphorus is pretty stable in the soil. It doesn't wash away with water, and it doesn't evaporate like nitrogen does. So those are the key things at the top. Now, this sample, the individual added a test for organic matter, which we see over here at the bottom. It's an optional test. It costs a little bit more when you send in the sample, but some people like to see that number, and I agree. It's very important. But this one is helping me explain this soil sample a little bit better. This says organic matter is at 7.83%. It's really high. Our target for organic matter for a really good soil, it probably maxes out at about 5%. If you can get a soil to float at about 4 to 5% organic matter, you're doing great. But if you start going above that, we start having some problems in the soil. And what I'm bet is happening here, if this is a garden vegetable bed, they're probably adding a lot of compost, and probably too much, right? Too much of a good thing, is the statement there. So once we're past that 5% and we start having this overage, well, a lot of times this compost that we're adding, composts are high in phosphorus. So that's explaining this phosphorus number that's off the charts over here. We're way high in it. And I'm assuming that it is becoming that it's becoming that way because this person is adding compost, but at a level that's not sustainable. We need to slow that down some. We need to bring that number back down. And with it, we need to decrease this application of phosphorus through compost. So then some of these other numbers will start to buffer down if we lower that back down to 4 to 5%.
Boone, I have a question on a related topic.
Mhm.
From BC, he says, we keep hearing the word erosion. What does it actually mean? How does it harm the soil quality? Aside from adding humus, what else can be done to prevent it?
Oh gosh, BC. We're gonna have to dive into this one later. You're opening a Pandora's box with it, but there's lots of different forms of erosion, either through water, through wind. In our situation, typically it's going to be water erosion for us, and the more what we call tilth or structure to the soil, it helps that soil maintain its structure. And then, so when we have maybe a heavy rain event, those soils are going to be less prone to breaking down and succumbing to disintegration and movement in water. Like if you just had sand, if I had a bucket of sand by itself and I poured a bucket of water over it, you see that sand just diminishes out in all directions. Versus if I had a clay soil or a soil that's binded together structurally with organic matter and I pour the same amount of water, it's going to keep most of that shape because it has structure to it. Versus a silt or a sand doesn't have that structure, and so it's more prone to erosion, in this case through water. But we'll have to sit down some other time, BC, and go into that one in more depth. But let me bring up one more thing here that I think is relevant. Is the pH. This one is kind of tricky. So the pH is 7.7, which is alkaline. It's high. We want to try to buffer that down. And really the only way we can do that ourselves is through the addition of sulfur. But in this case, what we see here is our sulfur is at 107 when our critical level is 13. It's also way off the charts. So we have a lot of sulfur in the soil, but it's not helping to buffer our pH down. If it is not that much. And I think that the reason why in this case is because it's being bound up by this excess amount of phosphorus in the soil. So this is real deep stuff, but it really makes sense on even just a basic level that if this phosphorus number came down, then I think that this excess amount of sulfur that's in the soil would be able to be released and start to modify our soil pH down to a reasonable level. Even in this situation, what we would recommend is that like maybe in the spring when you're planting your seeds in this vegetable garden, that you add powdered sulfur at planting and you incorporate that into the planting bed, where at least very temporarily, it's going to drop that pH down to maybe 6.8, so that those plants can get up and get growing within the pH level that they want. Eventually that pH may go back up because the chemistry is still the same, but temporarily we can alter that pH with the addition of elemental sulfur during planting. But the only way I think we're going to see this pH come back down is that if we can get this phosphorus level down, and then this excess sulfur is going to be able to help us impact the pH. I know, it's really dorky stuff. It's really sciencey stuff, but it's very relative to what you're trying to accomplish in your home landscapes, either in your vegetable garden or flower bed or turf grass area. If we can balance out these things, then you'll see a vast improvement on the growth and health of your plants. So I'll go over one more real quick, just to kind of see where we're at. Let me take about 30 seconds, and I want you to just look over this. Just for yourself. You don't have to say anything in the chat or anything, but just look at it and see if you can kind of figure out where the issues are with this, or what we might want to do to respond to this sample. And I can get a drink of water real quick. Okay. All right. So let's look at it. So here we have a lawn. This one up here at top says Bexar County. So if you know about Texas, you know that's San Antonio. So that would maybe explain our pH is at 7.9. That's high. This is basic soil. They're showing our critical level here is 6.2. So they want that even lower to be on our magic number. And again, this is moderately alkaline, but we got an issue with this pH here that we need to figure out how to address, even just a little bit. Our nitrate, we come across here, we see it's slightly past our critical level. Still recommending that we add a little bit of nitrogen. And if we thought about this much at all, the addition of nitrogen here suggests that we know this number is going to keep going down because plants are using it pretty quick and it's evaporating, and it's also leaching out beneath the root zone of our plants with water. So we have to constantly be thinking about ways to add nitrogen to the soil. Our phosphorus level here is 45 out of 50. So it's just a little bit low, not bad at all. But we want to try to bump that up here to our critical level. So we're recommending a very small addition of phosphate onto this profile. So 0.3 pounds per 1,000 square feet. If this is a phosphorus only fertilizer, we're maybe talking about 2 or 3 pounds of a phosphorus fertilizer for your whole lawn, if your lawn is 1,000 square feet. So not much for each of these, but you'll have to apply these separately because you're not going to find a fertilizer that just has nitrogen and phosphorus in it without adding the potassium as well. So we would need to find a nitrogen fertilizer, apply it at the rate here, and we would need to find a phosphorus fertilizer so we can apply it at its rate separately here. And that's about it. Some of these here are a little high. Calcium, we're way high, but this calcium level, if we know about the soils in the hill country, it's made out of limestone. It's just basically calcium. So that's why this number is really high. This isn't anything that you've added. This is just the nature of the chemistry of the soil. So it's going to be really high. Thus, we're going to have a high pH, and we need to try to find ways to add elemental sulfur, maybe once or twice a year, to try to bring that pH down just a little bit to manage our nutrients that much better. So with this one, soil pH is high. So we want to bring that down. We want to add just small amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus. Everything else here looks pretty good. the sample here, they didn't test for the organic matter. So we don't have that information to go by. So this is pretty typical of what you'll get back when you do a soil sample. You can email me or any member of our help desk here with the Fort Bend Master Gardeners, and we'd be happy to interpret the results and to help you with the recommendations, including a breakdown of which fertilizers we would recommend that you go look for to help address these shortages on the soil results. Any other questions on nutrients, Carol?
There are no other questions, and I have provided the garden helpline email address and phone number.
Very good, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and jump into the second part of our topic on weeds. Weeds. We, many of us, I think we spend most of our time, quote unquote, gardening, managing weeds. And so anything that we can do to minimize that, I think is a good thing. I'm gonna go over some terminologies. The focus on this presentation is a little kind of wrapped around turf grass. If you've got weed issues that are kind of outside of the lawn, some perennial or some shrub type weeds and things, I may not cover that here. So that might be something that you would want to reference our help desk and have a discussion with one of our volunteers on how to identify those weeds and how to respond to them. But basically, I'm not just a horticulturist, I'm a gardener as well. And so I like to do all that I can do to minimize weed pressure so that gardening for me is an enjoyable experience, activity. Pulling weeds. I haven't met a person who just raises their hand and says that that's just a joy that they have. Lynette, yeah, right. Just pulling weeds. There's for most of us, at least, it's not the reason that we garden. So we try to minimize that. Weeds, basically is by definition is an undesirable plant. So working with extension, it's kind of funny because, we may do a program in the morning for cattle ranchers on how to minimize pressure from honey mesquite on their forage range. And that evening, we may do a presentation with our coastal prairie master naturalists on the benefits of honey mesquite in a natural ecosystem. So for one, that's a weed, and for the other group, it is a very desirable plant. But it's all about the definition and whether you want it or not in that particular spot is kind of how we've simplified the definition of a weed. Why do we have weeds year after year? A lot of persistent plants, their seeds have a dormancy period that allows them to maybe stay dormant for several years in the soil. And then when the conditions are right, they can pop up and germinate. They tend to be plants that can produce quite a bit of seeds very fast. So they're able to spread off and regenerate quite often. They're easily transported through wind, or they like to grab onto your pants when you're walking across the field. And they're very adaptable to lots of different landscape or environmental situations to allow them to grow and get a stronghold in lots of different situations. So thus, you got to be persistent, and you have to be okay with the fact that new weeds are going to find their way into your landscape. You just can't get rid of them, but you can manage them. We tend to classify weeds into two categories. our warm season weeds and our cool season. And this is mostly the annual plants where some they'll germinate in the spring and they do most of their growth while it's hot, versus same thing with cool season. They start to actively grow in the fall, and then they stay growing through the winter and then in the cool parts of spring. Plants have different growing life cycles. This is important to know when we're identifying weeds and we're trying to respond to them with management. One being an annual, which means annually, this goes through its complete life cycle. So it germinates from a seed, it grows, it flowers, it produces seeds, it drops its seeds, and then at some point when the conditions are right, it goes through that process again every year. A biannual is very similar to that, but it's just a little bit longer growth period. So what happens with a biannual is it tends to germinate, grows up into a vegetative state, and then the next year it grows into a mature state, flowers, sets seeds, and then reproduces from there. And then a perennial, which means that it perennially lives. So year after year, it comes back either through an above ground structure, which is called a woody plant, or a herbaceous plant, which tends to die back at certain parts of the year down to a crown or to a root system, and then reemerge when the conditions are good for growth and development. So woody plants, these are going to be stuff like vines, trees, shrubs. And herbaceous will be a lot of our perennial garden plants or herbs that tend to die back during the winter and then flush back again during the warm growing season. So in identifying weeds, we also categorize these really into two groups, but we're throwing in this third one here of sedges. First one being broadleaf weeds, second grassy weeds, and then sedges. A lot of times the sedges get kind of built into the grassy weeds, but it is a good idea to separate those out. And I'll talk about those characteristics as we go through some examples. Broadleaves, these are called dicots, which means they have two seed leaves. And you see the little picture in the top right. Those are our seed leaves or cotyledons. And as it grows up, they tend to have broad leaves or wide leaves that are not grass-like or narrow in nature. They have veins on the leaves that are either branched or net-like, and the stems are either oval, round, square, and are often branched in structure. So examples of some of these will be our clovers, which is some of our common plants, either beneficial or weeds. This one here, mulberry weed. A lot of people have this popping up all over their garden. You see broadleaf. Broadleaf, it's got netted venation within the leaves, and it's branched. Sow thistle and ground plantain are also examples of some broadleaf plants that we typically see growing in our lawns throughout the year. And then our grassy leaves is this is a monocot or one seed leaf, which when it germinates, it just has one leaf instead of two. The leaves on grasses are parallel, which means they go straight down the leaf this way. They're not netted within the leaf. And the seed heads are often at the stems, in the stems or inconspicuous flowers towards the top of the plant. So examples of some of our grassy weeds are little annual bluegrass or Poa annua. It's a winter lawn weed. Annual ryegrass. You can see our dormant turf grass here, and then this big grass growing up during the cool season. We can see the spire of flowers and developing seed heads at the top of the plant. And going into the summer months, Dallas grass. This can be this big clumping mat of grass that moves out from the center. Again, these narrow, slender leaves with a parallel venation on them, and a picture of the developing flower and seed head here at the top, which is typical to a lot of grasses. Crabgrass. This is a young germinated seedling here in the landscape. As the plant gets older, it has these tall upright stems and has this pubescence or leaf and stem hairs on it. And then our seed head you see at the top, which is dried, that has mature seeds, quite a bit of seeds on this plant, which would fall down and then redevelop into new annual plants in the landscape. And the third category, sedges, very important. Most of these are hard to control weeds for us. They tend to look kind of like grass. They have the narrow, slender leaves, but if we cut the cross section of the main stem of these plants, they're triangular in nature, which helps you identify a sedge versus a grass. Shiny and smooth leaves, and then many of these have nuts or tubers attached to the roots underground that make them successful weeds in our landscapes. Some pictures of these: annual sedge, purple and yellow nut sedge. So the yellow nut sedge has yellow inflorescence, or the purple has a purple inflorescence on top. And then this narrow leafed kalinga, you tend to see these sedges and the kalinga in wet situations. These are mostly wetland plants. So if you have an area of the landscape that holds a lot of water, you'll tend to see these sedges really growing. Further than the leaf habit, very narrow upright leaves. For nut sedges, we see these little nodules or nuts that grow, and then they network together to form a webbing of young plants underground. That's how they propagate within the soil. You have one plant, and then it develops a little stolon or a rhizome underground, and it creates this next little baby plant, and then so on and so on. You kind of get this daisy chain of root nuts developing over a large area. That's the thing that makes this plant hard to control, is that each of these little nuts have a bank of carbohydrate storage. So if you're using weed killers on these, most of the time what happens is you kill the green part of the plant, but then at some point there's enough energy left from the carbohydrates in this nut that it will regenerate at some point and grow back again. So this next section here, I'm going to talk about herbicides. I think this is important because just about anybody can go to a hardware store or box store or garden center and pick up a whole range of basically agricultural chemicals and take them home with them without any license or agreement or anything, and are trusted to mix and apply that product. And so I think, especially working here with extension, a lot of what we see, a lot of what I deal with, a lot of what our help desk deals with is misuse or inappropriate use of herbicide products that have negatively impacted their landscape. So maybe they didn't get the thing that they wanted to have happen, and then a whole bunch of other stuff happened that they didn't want to have happen, which includes potential damage to their landscape, their soil and water, their local wildlife, and human health. So it's very important to understand not just the terminology, but the proper use of these products. So as we kind of break this down, talk about the types of herbicide. And so the terminology that you'll see is pre-emergent or post-emergent, contact or systemic, selective or non-selective. And I'll break those down here individually for you. First being pre-emergence or post-emergence. So pre-emergence means that it is impacting the plant before the plant emerges or grows out of the soil. So for a pre-emergent, this is a product that's applied before the plants even grow from a seed, before they even sprout. It's something that's put on the ground that inhibits the development of that seed. Either it stops it from germinating, or as it germinates, it impacts that plant negatively so that it dies. That's how a pre-emergent herbicide works. Post-emergent is a product that's applied on an existing plant. So you have a little bitty plant and you spray it, and it either kills the tissue on contact, or it's absorbed within the plant and kills it. Most of your post-emergent herbicides will have some type of a temperature range designation, particularly if it's one we use in a lawn. Like right now where it's, 145 degrees outside. We don't want to apply these products because they'll burn the grass. I think that's the heat index is 145. It's hot. So the next one is contact versus systemic. So a contact herbicide is one that when we spray it on the plant, it starts to impact that plant immediately. And this will be something like a vinegar that when we spray on the plant, it basically breaks down the cuticle of the leaf, and then the plant just basically dries out and the top part of the plant dies. A systemic herbicide is one that when we apply it to the roots of the leaves, it is absorbed through the plant tissue and it's translocated through the plant. So it gets down to the roots, the rhizomes and tubers, and ultimately tries to kill the whole plant. So these tend to be products that are more practical with perennial weeds, or weeds that are really hard to kill. Something that goes down and works slower, but does a better job of removing the plant completely instead of just killing the top part of the plant. So contact versus systemic. And then this one is selective and non-selective herbicides. So selective means that that chemical that's in that product will impact one plant negatively and maybe not impact a different type of plant. So the most situations for this are going to be turf grass weed killers or lawn weed killers, where maybe they don't impact your turf grass very, very much, but they do impact the broadleaf weeds that are within the lawn. And this is, a whole lot of trial and error has gone into identifying these very specific chemicals that will impact one plant, but maybe not impact another. A non-selective herbicide is a product that will try to kill any plant that it's applied to. So a product like glyphosate or Roundup is a trade name for that, is a non-selective herbicide. So if I have that and I'm walking across the lawn and dripping it in the lawn as I'm moving over to a flower bed to treat some weeds, within a week or two, I'm going to see dead spots where that chemical touched the ground, because it will try to kill any plant that it comes in contact with. They're within this selective and non-selective herbicide class is where you can really fine tune the right product to have an impact on one specific plant that's giving you a problem. But it also may help you minimize non-target issues within the landscape. So I'm not having to apply a lot of a product, or I'm just spot spraying one specific area. And so I'm minimizing potential runoff or damage to either other plants or wildlife in that area. And then this last one here that I'm going to brief on is what's called weed and feed. And we do a lot of preaching people out of using weed and feeds, and I'll explain a little bit of that for you. What a weed and feed fertilizer is that this is a combination of fertilizer and a granular herbicide or a selective herbicide that will kill weeds but not kill the grass that you have. And a lot of times this is a pre-emergent herbicide that's added into this product. But sometimes some of the formulations have a post-emergent activity, which means they'll also try to kill plants that already exist. And so for that reason, we don't recommend using weed and feeds in areas where you have existing trees and large shrubs. I don't know about you, but I don't know a whole lot of places or examples where we have turf grass only and we don't have any large trees in the vicinity of it. If I drive through Sugar Land or Stafford or Katy and some of these older neighborhoods, I'd be hard pressed to find a home landscape anywhere that just had turf grass and did not have any trees. Okay, so in any of those situations, we would not recommend using a weed and feed combination because the herbicide component, while it may not be designed to harm your trees, it can be absorbed in certain situations. If we have a heavy rainfall after your application, that product can be absorbed by those trees and large shrubs and maybe not kill them, but will cause stress. Will cause basically what we call acute toxicity. It's just a small amount of damage, but if you're using these products annually, that damage will build up to a plant stress level where those plants are going to start declining on you. So that's the first reason. The second reason is timing. And I'll show you a graph here in a minute that suggests that the pre-emergent herbicide that's in these products should be applied in February, but the fertilizer that's in these products should be applied in April. So we're applying one product and we're doing them at the wrong time. Each of them, we're not putting the pre-emergent out when it needs to be, and then we're probably tempted to fertilize too early in the spring. So for that reason, we don't recommend it because we're doing some damage here one way or the other. So in response to not using a weed and feed combination is just, you have to spend a little bit more time on your calendar and management to apply a herbicide at the right time and then apply your fertilizer later on at the right time. Okay, so basically in a nutshell, these are the main considerations that I'm hoping that we talked about a little bit, but I'm going to show a little visual here in 1 second to maybe help drive some of that home. First one maybe I didn't talk about is irrigation. Okay, irrigation, though well-intended, a lot of times can be the issue, the main cause or reason that we have weeds and or disease pressure in the landscape. It can cause root rot in a dormant grass. It can cause fungal diseases within the grass, and it can kind of supercharge weeds in times where maybe the grass is dormant or slow growing. We can be unintentionally providing a great environment for weeds to grow in. The second one is improper timing of fertilization, and this can cause weeds, disease, and plant stress. So again, while the plants are trying to go dormant, if we're fertilizing still, we're basically fertilizing weeds. We're basically encouraging that grass or plant to grow when it needs to be going dormant, and that causes issues within the plant. The third one there is an improper rate of fertilizer. So if we're adding too much or not enough of something, we get these imbalances in the soil. It's going to have an impact on the health of the plant. The improper timing of herbicides. This can cause turf damage. So it says temperature here. So make sure if we're using weed killers that we read those labels that talks about temperature ranges for the use of those products. Improper herbicide selection that can cause damage to desirable plants. So if we're using the wrong product, we might actually kill our own grass. I've seen products in some of the box stores here that aren't designed for southern turf grass. They're designed for bluegrass, northern states grasses. That if you put that in your grass in our summer, you're going to kill your grass. And beyond that, they might be putting on a product that will be absorbed by surrounding plants, ground covers, and trees and shrubs. And so ultimately, this is kind of just designed to rethink your management practices, doing some work on the planning and the management side can make a huge difference on the aesthetics of your landscape. So let me show you something real quick. While I'm doing this, Carol, do we have any floating questions?
We do.
Okay.
There's a question, and it's from Esmeralda. She's prepping a bed for native plants. It does not have sod. Is solarization an effective method, or is it necessary?
Okay. So solarization can do a lot of things, but if we're trying to take an area that has a native sod on it and we're trying to use that to kill the existing vegetation, I don't think it's a good standalone practice, because where some stuff like there's St. Augustine grass there, we can burn that off pretty quick. It's pretty easy to kill. But if you got some persistent things in there, like Bermuda grass, nutsedge, dollarweed, Virginia buttonweed, dayflower, stuff that's perennial, that's persistent, that has root storage nodules, tubers in it. A lot of times what'll happen is you'll solarize it, you pull off the plastic, everything looks good, but the first rain that we get on it, all that perennial stuff just resurges, just comes right back like nothing happened to it. So as a standalone process, I don't think that's the way to go. Usually I spend more time if I'm talking about solarization. It's trying to use that as a way to maybe eliminate some disease pressure or reoccurring pest pressure in a vegetable garden situation, where I can put plastic on there to kill stuff like nematodes, or to kill out some persistent reoccurring eggs from insects, or if I have some disease pressure in that soil, like southern blight on tomatoes. Using that solarization as a way to kind of sanitize the top layer of that soil. But for weed control, it's really not the best option, because you kill the easy to kill annual weeds, but you don't really impact your perennial hard to control things. Where it looks like maybe you did, and you go over the top of that and plant your wildflower garden or whatever, I think you're going to be really upset when those pre-existing perennial plants start to reemerge with a vengeance.
Okay, thank you. One final question so far. Is Randy Lemon's weed and fertilizer schedule recommended?
Oh, come on. Don't do this to me. Rest in peace, Randy Lemon. He is a good name in our region, a wealth of information, was very passionate about horticulture and providing that information to people. But I think one disclaimer there that I tend to mention is that this was a radio show where they were endorsing products for sale. And so we have to realize that some of these schedules of products may be based off of trying to market a particular product to you. So that's kind of buyer beware with that. If you want sound, unbiased horticultural advice, I'll show you a little input graph here in a second that will help you make some of those decisions that aren't based off of going and buying a product. If I can put that in a simple way. Any other questions?
That's it, Boone.
Okay, cool. All right, so first what I'm going to do here real quick, I'm just going to kind of show you the website for our soil and water testing laboratory. This is our beautiful mecca of an old brick house up here in College Station, where all this magic happens, where we test your soil samples when you send them in. Also test water or forage. So for like hay producers, we'll test for nutrients, and water, we can test your municipal water or your well water for the contents of those water samples. But basically, we're going to go down here to submittal forms, and I'm just going to show you here urban soil submittal form. So this is the little application that I was talking about earlier. Fill out your personal information, and we start to choose which sample. So the routine analysis is number one, costs you $12, not bad. And that gives you our basic reading. If we want to add organic matter, number 6, you can see here the price triples, $32 a sample if we want the organic matter. But if just for a routine, which is your pH and your macronutrients, $12 is pretty easy. You just fill out this information. What are we trying to test? Well, if it's lawn, we'll say it's St. Augustine grass or Bermuda grass. But you can also test your orchard, your fruit trees, your flowering plants, your vegetables, and so forth. And you just fill out this information, and then they will conduct the soil analysis. And then based off of whatever this I'm growing thing is, they have a coefficient that helps spit out the response on their end. So they'll send you back an email that'll have a PDF, and it shows that result and the recommendations. So this is how to take a soil sample. So it kind of gives you just the basic overview, how to take it, how to mail it. It's a quick process. During the slow times of year, if you mail it in, usually within 2 weeks, you'll get the email with the response from it. So again, that's soiltesting.tamu.edu for the soil testing lab. Now here, this is, you can see behind me here, I've got these A&M references all over the place, but this is what we do in the state of Texas. And this is our Aggie turf. This is our turf grass division up in College Station. This is their homepage, and you can just type in Aggie turf, and it'll pop up at the top. A lot of good resources here on weeds, insects, different types of turf grass. But if I click on this publications, a whole lot of different publications that you can find here, and on everything from cultural practices or watering, how often do I need to be watering, weed control, like here, a homeowner's guide to herbicide selection for warm season turf grass. Like, this is some pretty good stuff, and it's all free of charge. It's research backed. It's non-biased. It's all good information. Insects, disease control. This right here, this is like a 200-page publication on all things insect, weed, and disease control. It's like the Bible of products for turf grass management. But let's look at this here, this lawn management calendar. I'm going to do this St. Augustine management calendar. Can you see that okay? Is that showing up on your screen, Carol?
I can see it very well.
Okay, good. Okay. So, this is kind of going back to the question about garden line, whether it's garden line management or nitrophos management guide. This is something similar to what you would see from a company but here by the months, they may be putting a product, apply this product here, apply this product here. Okay. But this one here is really, it's showing considerations. These are the things throughout the year, whether it's mowing, fertilization, aerification, thatch, weeds, irrigation, insect, disease, considerations, things you should be thinking about every month of the year. Now, what I would like to show on here, let's see if I can figure this out. Okay. All right. So this is January through December. And I know I'm just slightly over here, but this is important. And we have this right here shows the growth of our warm season grass, our St. Augustine grass. And then underneath that here, it shows the root growth in equal but opposite direction. And so I think this is very important for a homeowner to understand, is that St. Augustine grass goes dormant. It naturally wants to get some sleep, right? It's tired after the end of the year in Texas. It wants to go to bed for a while. I don't blame it. So in December, it wants to go to sleep and it doesn't want to wake up until March. But when that, along with that root shoot growth diminishing, it actually sheds its roots in the winter. When it goes dormant on the top, just like an oak tree drops its leaves, it sheds off quite a bit of its root system. So while it's dormant, it's dormant. It's not really doing much of anything. And as the temperatures start to warm up, it gradually grows, but it's really not until about April 1st or April 15th where we start to see a lot of new root activity and then subsequent foliar growth, shoot growth on the top of the plant. So that's when it's growing. And then over here, around in November 1st, it's doing the equal but opposite thing. It's starting to slow down, starting to lose some roots, and it's going dormant. So let's think about watering, okay? When you're watering, if you got an irrigation system, if you're watering December and January and February, what are you watering? Plant doesn't have any roots. It's not putting on any growth. Guess what you're watering? Weeds. You're watering those cool season weeds, and they're getting fat and healthy over here with that extra water that you're putting on. So we recommend, and I'll even scroll down here, irrigation, turn it off. Turn it off that you're not, when your turf grass is not actively growing. Just go out there and just click it over to off and keep it off probably sometime until mid-March, early March. Same thing here, turn it off in November. Whenever we start to see some cooler weather, just go in there, turn it off. That's the easiest way to stop weeds, is you're not giving them the opportunity to grow while this grass is dormant. Okay. So we need to maximize water availability here in June through August, because this is when the plant is growing the most. So we need the water there, but we don't need it during the winter months while this grass is dormant.
All right,
So,
Boone, I wanted to
Yeah.
interrupt real quick before we lose our audience. It's a little after 3:30. We had two questions. The first one is there anything that can control Dallas grass? And the final question, or maybe there are two more questions, is if you're on a water well system, are any products safe to use for weed control?
okay. Well, if those people that are asking the questions, if y'all will stay on the caboose,
Okay,
I promise I'll answer those questions. But I would like to get over this last two things here, because I think these are crucial and I'm going to try to get them done quick. So similar to the watering is this fertilization. I talked to a lot of people and they're fertilizing in February. And, we don't recommend that you fertilize until the 1st of April here in Fort Bend County. So when you're fertilizing in February, a lot of times all you're doing is applying fertilizer to these summer weeds. and you're giving them a jump start on the grass, making those weeds harder to control. Similarly, you see a lot of these products called winterizers. A winterizer in definition, it needs to be a fertilizer that's applied in mid-August, way up here. But a lot of times people assume since it's a winterizer that you apply that in October or November, but we don't want to do that because the grass is going to sleep. So when we put a fertilizer down in November, again, we're just fertilizing winter weeds. So don't do it. We want to keep our fertilization right in here. If I'm making a recommendation, we're putting fertilizer on the first 2 weeks of April. We're putting one again here in between July and August, and that's it. And then we're just letting that diminish slowly as the plant starts to go dormant for the winter time. So these are the most crucial cultural things that you can do is change your watering practice, change your fertility practice, and you will minimize the weeds that you see from that. So I would encourage you to go look at this resource. If you have Bermuda grass, there's a similar calendar here as well. There's also this management guide for St. Augustine grass that really goes through everything that I talked about in a lot of detail as well. So great stuff. It's out there. It's free of charge. It's open 24/7. Go take advantage of it. The last slide that I have here is a little survey. I'll leave that up. If you've got one of those QR readers on your phone, you can snap that little QR code and it'll take you to a short little survey about today's class. And I would be more than happy at this point to go back and address some of these questions that you have, Carol. Let's start with Dallas grass.
Dallas grass. Yeah, Dallas grass. How do you kill Dallas grass?
Okay. So, I mentioned this pre-emergent versus post-emergent herbicide. This is an annual weed that germinates early in the spring. Once the temperatures start warming up, but it doesn't really become a monster until early summer. And once we see a Dallas grass, it's a big clumpy mess. And at that point, you either spot treat it with herbicide and just try to kill that one plant, and you create this big dead spot, or you have to take a shovel and we have to physically dig that clump out of the ground and then backfill that hole with some soil or some compost or something after it's gone. Either way, the end product looks terrible. You're going to have either a dead spot or you're going to have a big hole where you've had to dig up this giant Dallas grass clump. So what we tend to recommend is a pre-emergent herbicide, and that'd be a product that you put on in February before those seeds germinate. So I mentioned the weed and feed, right? So the weed and feed people usually put on in March, and you're putting that on before the grass needs fertilizer, and you're putting the herbicide on too late because by March or April, the Dallas grass is already germinated. It's already growing. So then now that herbicide doesn't really do much for it. You need to find just the pre-emergent herbicide from one of your local hardware stores or garden centers that's listed for southern lawns. And you need to apply that at the appropriate time. And for us, it's going to be mid-February for that application. So what it does is it puts a blanket out. So if there's any of those Dallas grass seeds, once they try to grow, they abort, and you just really start minimizing the amount of seed stock that you have in that soil profile. Something that you might have to do annually for 2 or 3 years. But at some point, with proper management of the grass, you may start seeing less incidence of the Dallas grass in the area.
Thank you, Boone. The last question is, if you're on a water well system, are any of these products safe to use for weed control?
Are we, is that person still online? Can you tell?
Let me check.
I'm assuming that they're talking about,
Yes, it's initials MA. I don't know the name.
okay. So I'm assuming there that you're talking about maybe those products leaching down into the water table.
I would assume.
Okay, okay. So, my answer to that is going to be to follow the label recommendations on the product. And sometimes it'll say on there, environmental considerations that say, don't apply this during temperature variances or during periods of heavy rainfall or something like that. Maybe listed on the label. But basically the concept there is that you put the appropriate amount of product, it does its job, and then that chemical diminishes in some short period of time. The potential of really anything, fertilizers, organic matter, biologicals, to penetrate down into the water table is really not relevant. The only times we see those types of issues is during floods, like when we had Hurricane Harvey. If you have if your water well head is very low, like 1 to 2 feet from the ground surface, and then we have flood waters that pass that level, and the surface water is able to penetrate the head of your well and move down, then basically anything that's on the surface, whether it's chemicals, bacteria, you name it, can work its way down into your water table. Not only your water table, but anybody that shares that aquifer within a reasonable amount of square footage could also be contaminated by that. But just direct leaching from the surface down, because most of our water wells, we're talking about starting at 500 feet is where the water source is, where the aquifer is at. And a lot of times it's even more than that. So we're not seeing any type of direct penetration down through the profile.
All right, thanks, Boone. Brandy, I think final remarks are appropriate at this point.
All right, thank you all for joining us today. Our next class will be on trees for small landscapes on August 18th. And I believe that's it. Boone, you're good? You don't have anything else? All right. You all have a great and safe weekend. Stay cool.
Thank y'all for hanging out with us.